you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm well, thanks, and I hope you are too, despite the drop in temperature. I'm sure you've been following what's going on in Hong Kong, and
Yes.
I feel this is very significant because gradually starting in the 19th century, yes, we're going back a long way today. As the populations everywhere got larger and larger, and global connections became more and more significant. The efforts to organize larger and larger numbers of people was attractive and to some extent necessary. And of course, the most historically significant example probably was the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. And that worked amazingly well, so that one man, as far as we could see, was able to completely control social life in the largest country in the world for several decades, and then his successors managed to continue the same thing for several more decades. And then everybody in the Western world was just as surprised when it all fell apart in the 1980s, and then the whole thing dissolved in the beginning of the 90s. And it looks as though the same thing may now, perhaps I'm an optimist, but seems to be happening in Hong Kong. What's happening in Hong Kong seems to be a symptom of a similar process in China, which was the country which was not quite as large, but one of the largest countries in the world, but had one of the largest populations, and the population, of course, has been growing significantly over. It's grown almost threefold in 10 how many years? Mm-hmm. Since the middle of the last century, and there were big protests against the way it was organized in 1989, and now it's trying to extend its organization over all the parts, all the territories that it claims.
Well, I've always commented in
now this the way I see this is that touch with you. Are you?
Yeah.
Things seem to be the way the problems of organization become greater. We've been saying in these weekly video blogs that we think that the organization is the biggest problem in globalization. But I'm beginning to wonder whether organization as we've understood it before, of which, of course, the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China are extreme examples, may not be the organization of the future, and that the way things are likely to work in a global population of 10 to 12 billion that we're expecting to see by the end of this century will be a much more fluid type of interaction with I'm not sure what the best vocabulary would be to talk about this yet, but that the organization will work on the local level, and humans will be interacting with each other, and it's actually the process of interaction which will generate the organization rather than, so it'll be bottom-up organization from now on, rather than the top-down organization that we've been depending upon since the beginning of the colonial period.
Right, right. Well, I think with since we've been having these discussions, I've always suggested that China is not a sure bet for the long term, simply because of the fact that there are too many people to be held down as too many extraneous forces from the internet and from the West and from elsewhere are bombarding the population incessantly. It's very difficult for one man or a cadre or a group of people to control them. The second thing that struck me is what would happen if Mark Zuckerberg was on these calls with us? And you just had made the statement that you had made that in the future you thought it was going to be a lower level kind of horizontal organization, and you weren't sure how it was going to manifest itself. And I'm sure he would say to you that, well, wait a minute, that platform already exists. We have it. We can have little subgroups of 4 or 5 people. We can have subgroups of 40 to 50,000 people or 4 to 5 million people, where people can group and meet with each other and advance their own interests and platforms. So, and I wouldn't necessarily argue with him. I think that perhaps he would have a point. So I think that the future is here now, which is what's accounting for what's going on in Hong Kong, which has happened so quickly, which is also what's accounting for what's going on in Washington right now. I mean, a month ago, nobody was talking about impeachment. Now it's all but an uncertainty. Now it's all but a certainty. In London, a month ago, nobody was talking about Boris Johnson being stopped. Now it's inevitable that he's going to be stopped. So things happen very quickly now, and I think that's because it's the bottom-up kind of organization, and people have the ability and empowerment to group together and to make their voices heard.
What we still have to wait to find out is how this bottom-up organization of interaction is going to relate to financial organization. But I suspect that could fit in the long run, simply because financial organization has been expanding without, it has been bottom-up financial organization.
Yeah, I think the financial organization automatically, by definition, has to devolve down to the lowest level, to the consumer. All right. I mean, if people aren't ultimately going to buy what the juggernaut is going to produce one way or the other, and it's not going to provide a so-called value add. I mean, that's the big term in business these days, a value add. Then it's not going to be profitable. It's not going to make money. So business has to produce something of value to somebody. There always has to be a buyer. And then that in turn is a chain, and somebody has to buy from that buyer, and then somebody has to buy from that buyer, and ultimately you and I are the buyers. So your point's well taken. But which is why, again, if you look at it from the bottom up, boycotts and financial concerns that are expressed about one country's goods that are spread at the bottom up level, I mean, these have impacts. They have effects.
But it's interesting to consider in relation to this that the corporation, which is a form of organization that was first began to develop in the Roman Empire,
yeah,
and then began to expand in the late medieval period, is now probably the most efficient and useful form of organization we have anywhere in the world.
I wouldn't argue with that. But by definition, with only just a few exceptions, it's a very short-sighted mechanism. It's only concerned about the next quarter's financial report, the next quarter's profits. There's a very, very small part of the corporation's brainpower, with the exception of companies like Apple, perhaps, and others, that are looking forward into the future and planning for future product lines and future success. Being answerable to shareholders in such a short-term cycle every 3 months, I think has really produced a bit of a stasis, if you will.
But it's a form of top-down organization that caters to the bottom because it's looking for support all the time. It's not it's incapable of imposing organization,
mm-hmm.
And so it's very adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
So
when you look at China and Hong Kong, how does this apply there? Is this a bottom up kind of?
Well, this is the test of the what should I call it? The form of organization that was developed was proposed by Marx in the 19th century, which was successful in the Soviet Union for 70 years in the 20th century, which the Chinese took over and have adapted very well to their own purposes since then. But it's not working. It's been having problems over the starting 30 odd years ago, and it looks as though its problems are getting more and more difficult for it. And so I see Hong Kong as the symptom of the beginning of a Chinese failure to continue to organize 1.4 billion. Is it 1.4 billion people?
It is.
Well,
let me ask you this: do you think the President Xi understands this? Is that why he's so reluctant to send in tanks?
I think he's a very intelligent and capable character, and I think that he's very concerned about China's position in the world, and probably, I mean, I have no idea what goes on in his head really, but I suspect that he doesn't want China to appear to be forcing by using lethal force in order to get its own way. But it seems as though China's not going to get its own way in Hong Kong without lethal force, and of course, with lethal force, it would lose Hong Kong's current global position.
Well, it's not exactly analogous, but this is a good example of how things have changed in 30 years. I mean, 30 years ago, when there were 100,000 protesters in Tiananmen Square, Deng Xiaoping, I mean, he was patient for a little while, but then ultimately he acted. Here, 30 years later, Deng Xiaoping's successor, who's molded himself as his successor in that line of legitimacy, is refraining from pulling the trigger for the reasons we're discussing, because he's on a high wire act, recognizing that the top-down organization may be a little bit fragile, and if he acts precipitously, he's going to empower the bottom-up organization thrust.
Yeah. I think he realizes that for China's global success, it's got to be seen to be acting in a way that will be attractive to other people, especially in Africa at the moment, for example.
How smart are the Hong Kong protesters? They must recognize this if you and I are sitting 7,000 miles away recognizing this.
It's difficult to tell because I haven't been to Hong Kong for a long time now, and I'm really surprised to see how many people in Hong Kong are involved in these protests.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems as though there is there must be a long history to the mutual feeling between people in the British administered island and the mainland.
I didn't realize that there was. I thought that that there was really only that upper crust of civil administration that distinguished the island from the mainland. But it's very interesting. You're right to see this now. that in fact there
Yeah.
are two distinct groups of people, or they at least view themselves as, one group does view themselves as distinct. So how do you think they're going to deal with the face mask ban? Are they just going to arrest anybody with face masks?
I don't know. I mean, the details are very interesting, the way it's actually developing. And I have no idea what the next stage is going to be.
Well, right now it's 10 minutes to 9 on Saturday night there. There's probably something going on as we speak.
Yeah.
Yeah, so in an hour or two we should begin to see things on the news. So, and one final comment I must ask you: what do you think Britain is going to end up doing now in the next several weeks?
Well, I mean, the United Kingdom has a very serious problem of the government is not working. The people in different parts of the United Kingdom want different answers, and the relationship between the United Kingdom and the European Union is two-sided, and the breakup is not good for either of them.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's certainly a comparable situation to what's going on in Hong Kong. And one hopes that whatever happens on October 31st, that they'll continue talking to each other until they work out some form of some way to live together. But one wonders why they can't simply return to what things would have been if they hadn't joined the European Union.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Which doesn't seem to be on the agenda at all.
I think what's going on in Britain today and what's going on in the United States today and what's going on in Hong Kong are examples of bottom up kind of artillery shots that went in the wrong direction. I don't think the potency and power of bottom up activities has been fully appreciated yet, and I think the election of Trump was a manifestation of that. But I think after it happened, everybody was, wow, did we just do that? I think the choice of Brexit was a bottom up thrust, and I think after that people were like, holy mackerel, now what? And I think what's happening in China, I mean, is ultimately going to get to be the same thing if tanks start coming over the causeway there. People are going to go, well, wait.
I think that the reason for all this is that we're a social species, and the larger the number of people interacting with each other, the more we change.
Mm-hmm.
So that with the enormous increase in the number of people interacting with each other over the last 30 years has meant that not only have we seen more technological innovation than ever before in that length of time, but the way we work politically is totally different from anything before. And in fact, everything in everyday life is different from everything before. And so that means that the institutions we had in the 20th century are not going to work in the rest of the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
So life is going to get more and more interesting for optimists.
Well, and then for pessimists, life's going to get worse and worse and worse. Well, that's good. We'll balance each other out. All right. Well, Brian, thank you, Professor Spooner. We'll chew on that for a week, and we'll look forward to speaking again next week. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Right. Spooner, how are you today?
Good morning, Frank. I'm fine, thanks, and I hope you are too.
Thank you.
This morning, I think you know that some time ago now, in an introductory essay to a volume on globalization, I wrote that globalization was on the cards from the start.
Yes.
because I thought that the fact that population growth had led us to spread throughout the world, and we had language, meant that sooner or later we were all going to be in contact with each other. But what's always puzzled me is why, in fact, do people always collect together in the largest possible numbers? And that's happened throughout human history. And until about 10,000 years ago, the numbers were always very small because of the availability of food, and we were not yet producing our own food.
Mm-hmm.
But since food has not become a problem, we keep collecting together in larger and larger numbers, and now we're going to become a totally urbanized world in what remains of this century, as far as I can see. Anyway, somebody I met in an elevator a few years ago and got talking to about the axial age and big history, and then we became quite close friends and have been talking to each other ever since. Had an interesting new idea this week, which he told me about, which I think helps us to understand a lot of things. And that is that when we left our primate cousins up in the trees in South Central Africa and came down onto the plains and wandered out away from the trees on the plains, we were vulnerable to predators. Yes. In a way that we had never been before. And it was then that we started collecting together in larger and larger numbers in order for security. And that tendency seems to have been part of our evolution, because after all, we had not evolved entirely into the creatures we became in the following millennia. That was hundreds of thousands of years ago. Mm-hmm. And so I think that explains it. However, the problem, of course, that we have now is that we have to organize ourselves, and it's our organization of ourselves which is leading to all the problems. So this evolutionary proclivity that appears to have been launched a few 100,000 years ago is still driving us to collect together in larger and larger numbers. And now there are really no restrictions on that process. Mm-hmm. But because as the numbers get larger, the organizational problems get bigger. All the problems we're having in globalization have to do with different forms of organization. And of course, when the literacy helped us to develop much larger forms of political organization and economic organization, for that matter. And then the age of empires started with literate administrations some 4,000 years ago, and lasted really until the middle of the last century, when we finally got rid of the European empires. But the empires really did bring things closer together. Mm-hmm. But the problem with the empires was that they divided the world up into administrative districts, and when they disintegrated and ceased to be empires in the middle of the last century, or in the first since 1900, their administrative districts became what we have come to call nation states, because of the problems of the relation of the interrelation of spiritual and political authority, mm-hmm. which we've sold in some ways for some periods, as with the Pope and the archbishops and so on in the Catholic Church, but not on a permanent basis, as we can see with the Reformation 500 years ago. Anyway, So now we have this problem of um, uh, um, conflict between, well, since the end of the Age of Empires, we've had a sort of fake empire run by America as the world hegemon, um, and that has added to the problems of the um, uh, formation of nation states, because the whole point of the formation of nation states was that each state would be independent in terms of religion as well as political organization, and it would and no state would have the right to tell neighboring states what the correct interpretation of the Bible was.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem with American hegemony has been that not only has it been influencing the development of nation states since the end of the empires, but it's also been exerting cultural influence in other ways. And so now we have this terrible problem between, well, with Iran, for example, in the Middle East. And last Friday, when we were unable to meet, I spent the day in Washington at a board meeting of an organization that is a consortium of American universities, and I was representing the University of Pennsylvania, working out how to solve some of the current problems of the American Institute of Iranian Studies, which is an organization that began in the late 60s that I've been involved in ever since. And of course, since the Iranian Revolution has not been able to function in the way that it was functioning before. And this has meant that whereas we had a way of training Iranists, people specializing in Iranian studies, which is quite a well-developed historical field of academic study. But since then, since the late 70s, we've not been able to train anybody in this field. Mm-hmm. And now all the people who were trained in that field and were heading programs in half a dozen universities in America, apart from other universities in Europe,
they're all retiring.
Are retiring, and there's nobody to replace them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this means that whereas up until 50 years ago, we knew a lot about the world, that is in universities, although people in the State Department tended not to know very much about the rest of the world. Now, in the age of globalization, because of what we've been doing in other ways, we're not training scholars and scientists with experience in the world as a whole.
Right. Let me jump in a little bit. You've thrown a lot at me from that one elevator ride, and thankfully you indicated that you had developed a close friendship with this person, and it was not all in one elevator ride. I fully understand the fact that Neanderthals who descended from the trees and were able to make it out to the plains, especially those who could hold their young under one arm to get out to the watering hole, and thus were forced to stand up straighter because they were carrying their young, and then do that and get back into the safety of the woods, and then come back the next day with another mother with another young child, and then groups of them eventually, in order to just protect themselves in the event of predators, so more would be able to return to the safety of the trees. And going on to where we are today, I mean, this is a blink of an eye in history, right? This is what, 30 or 40 or 50,000 years or so. So where this is going to go, I think where that group of Neanderthal mothers with their babies at a watering hole out in the middle of a plain in South Central Africa, 5 or 6 of them, 50,000 years ago to where we are now with 22 million people living in Mexico City or 1.5 billion people connected on Facebook, to have happened in 50,000 years is pretty remarkable. And then I superimposed that fact on the President of the United States making the speech on Wednesday in front of the United Nations, in which he said globalization is dead. It's no longer operable. It's been replaced by national patriotism. And I just don't get it. I don't understand it. Is it a complete? I mean, the speech had to have been written. It clearly was not written by the president. The way he delivered it was clear. He had not read it before. It's official policy of the United States government. I mean, how is it that people are not understanding what's happening, where even the most ill-informed president of this country can stand there and make that kind of remark? I don't understand where the disconnect is. What do you think?
There's so much competition between political units of different sizes. So the large ones compete with each other globally, and now there's competition, obviously, between developing competition between America, Europe, European Union, and China, and India, actually, and locally, but among smaller units. So between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which their relationship's been in the news this past week because they can't agree on their border, which again was drawn by the British in 1893. And Africa is just a patchwork of these problems. So I'm afraid, in my mind, of course, I have to be careful what I say so that I don't appear to be chauvinist, but I think that America is causing more problems like this than any of the other large countries at the moment, although that may change as the others gradually become more powerful. Because, to a large extent, the reason is that the people in charge of policy in this country are not academically trained to understand what's going on in other parts of the world. And 50 years ago, I don't think people in America were that well trained either, partly because they are, whereas in Europe, every country is very close to every other country, and then many of them had empires which took them to all over the world. America didn't have an empire, at least not in that sense, and had two large ponds, one on either side, which separated it from what was going on in other parts of the world. And now we're told that only 30% of Americans, even now in the 21st century, have passports.
Right. So
it's really is an anomaly that the economically most powerful country in the world is the center of the least knowledge about what's going on in the rest of the world.
So in a funny way, when we several years ago would talk about nations or states, we would talk about states that were actively trying to thwart the forces of globalization. All right, and we would talk about countries such as North Korea. We would talk a little bit about Iran, I think, even. Where we are now, after several years of discussion, the United States has now entered that category.
Yeah.
Isn't that something?
Well, you know, I mean, it's such a paradox, really, that the Middle East is most of the boundaries in the Middle East were drawn by Europeans, and then reinforced by Americans. And American policy since the middle of the last century has been to not to export democracy, but to reinforce political stability as Americans understood it, which was not democracy, because democracy was unpredictable, partly because it wanted to nationalize local oil companies, which were American owned.
Right.
And Britain had something to do with this as well. I'm not.
Anglo-American oil.
Yeah.
Well, very interesting. So what do you think when you get back to your view of the progressive nature of globalization, going back to that blink of an eye to our cousins or descendants or ancestors, I should say, coming out of the trees into the plains? Where are we going here?
Well, I think that I mean what that explains is why coming together has been a more important part of the historical process than conflict. And now there's probably more conflict now than there has been, or more serious conflict now than there has been in the past, because of these problems of organization. But I think it's going to change again as the differences in economic and political power between America, the European Union, and the other large political units, especially China and India, they become more closely related to each other and have to reach some sort of agreement, because at the moment there's no effort at all to reach agreement on a global level. The United Nations was, in a way, developed with that purpose, but has been not been successful.
Well, I think we should probably leave it at there, Professor Spooner. Very interesting. I'm going to keep that in mind as I try to interpret the events of this week and the week coming up. So,
We'll watch what happens.
Yes. All right. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.